حي على الفلاح.
One day, the Prophet ﷺ said to Aisha, "Ya Aisha, can you call my companion?" And she said, "Who? Abu Bakr?" He said, "No." She said, "Who? Umar?" He said, "No." She said, "Who? Uthman?" It's always in that order, subhanAllah. He said, "Yes." So Uthman comes in and he asks Aisha to move away a little bit. He needs to talk to Uthman something quietly. So he says to Uthman something which made Uthman's face go pale. He says, "You will be subjected to a fiṭna. Do not fight or resist them. Don't fight back when that time comes, but be patient. Be patient. When the day came, they will come to you to tell you to take off your cloak. Do not fight them and do not take off your cloak." And from that day, Uthman said, "I promised not to do that." Do you know why, brothers and sisters, the Prophet ﷺ told him don't fight them and don't take off your cloak? Because the people who are going to be fighting him are going to be none other than Muslims themselves. And the Prophet ﷺ does not want Muslims to fight each other. "O Uthman, stand up and promise that you will act according to the commandments of the Quran and the Sunnah and his two caliphs before you, Abu Bakr and Umar." Uthman stands up and he says, "I promise and pledge to the best of my knowledge and ability." And everybody pledges, including Ali radiyallahu anhu. And he follows Uthman. Uthman makes his first address to the people. You know what he said? He goes, "O people, it's not easy to manage a new horse. There'll be other occasions to speak to you. If I live, I will address you another day." You all know I'm not very good at public speaking. He sits down and leaves the people. From here, everybody knows that Uthman is a softie. He's forgiving. He just wants peace. He wants people to live together. If he makes a mistake, he says, "Tell me, man. Tell me and I'll fix it." So he would try his best to keep the peace between people. And you know what? Allah didn't just put Uthman there for no reason. It's not just coincidence. Uthman was there because the type of people that he was about to lead. This type of people that he was about to lead needed forgiveness, needed that you need to sacrifice yourself in order to create peace. Uthman led the Ummah for 12 whole years, longer than all the four Khalifas. 11 years of absolute triumph to Islam. Conquests upon conquests happened and the lands of the Arabs were returned back to the Muslims. These conquests were not that they attacked. They just returned land that belonged to the Muslims that were ruled by the Persians before and by the Romans. One day, Uthman puts officials and officers in different states and he says to them, "Be just in your dealings. Be honest with your money matters. Be fair and tolerant to the non-Muslims, to keep their word and promises even with the enemy." And he said to them, "Do not be like masters or rulers." This was the policy of Uthman radiallahu anhu, just like Umar and Abu Bakr. Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas, the Prophet ﷺ's maternal uncle, he was made an officer, a governor of Kufa. Kufa is in Iraq. And the Muslims had taken over Kufa and the Persians were out. So Kufa is under the governance of Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas. A letter from Abdullah ibn Mas'ud reaches Uthman and says to him, because Abdullah ibn Mas'ud was made an inspector on the governors. He made sure that the governors did their work well. See how much justice and fairness there was. And nobody got upset with anyone else. So Abdullah ibn Mas'ud says, Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas borrowed some money. And he promised to pay it on a certain time, but he was late in his payment. Uthman ibn Affan takes Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas off his post. He says, "My officers and my governors have to be the best role models. If they delay their debts, everybody else is going to delay their debts." So he takes him off immediately. And he keeps doing these things in accordance with justice and Islam. They expand to Cyprus, to North Africa, to Sicily, the Mediterranean Sea, to Persia and to Turkestan. But they don't advance to East Pakistan and they don't go to India. In the time of Uthman radiallahu anhu, there was nobody poor enough to come and take zakat anymore because of the zakat system. Amazing. So it went to the public treasury. And Uthman radiallahu anhu used to take from it and use it on soldiers and horsemen, and he used to give it to businessmen to make it even better and employ other people, you know, and so on. Anyone who was in need, new people who converted to Islam, he used to use it for that. One day, a civil war broke out, and here is the story. They took advantage of Uthman's old age and his soft nature. Do you know how old Uthman radiallahu anhu was in the 12th year of his Khilafah? He was 83 years old. White hair, very, you know, he was tired, he was weak, he was an old man. And people took advantage of that. He overlooked the faults of others. So some governors and officers, which he placed, started to be like the Persians and Romans, people of authority and power. They were not companions, they were people who embraced Islam later on. Like a dictatorship. And this grew until it was all over the Islamic regions. Dictatorship, power, mastery over people. There was a man by the name of Abdullah ibn Saba. He was a Jew who secretly embraced Islam, not telling people that he's a Jew. He was a hypocrite. And the Prophet ﷺ said to Uthman, in Bukhari and Muslim this is, he said to him, "O Uthman, the hypocrites are going to kill you." Abdullah ibn Saba was an ex-Jew. He lived in Yemen, in Najd, Yemen. And he was the one who stirred up the situation. He comes into Medina acting like a pious man, but he was actually a spy. He dressed well, he prayed well, he grew his beard. He goes to Banu Hashim. Remember, Banu Hashim wanted Ali radiallahu anhu to be the Khalifa, right? So he takes advantage of that to make fitna and stir up trouble. Now it's conspiracy, you know, making up accusations. You know, you were right. Ali radiallahu anhu should have been the Khalifa. And he makes up a new slogan. He says, love of the Prophet and love of his family should come first. He's saying a word of truth, wanting enmity to develop from it. Therefore, Ali is the rightful Khalifa and Uthman must be removed. Now, the companions didn't buy that. He's after the ignorant and the weak. So he goes off and he finds people start to follow him. He secretly went around the cities and provinces, campaigning and lobbying. He spoke secretly to head figures, people in power, and governors, whom he knew had complaints about Uthman ibn Affan. 12 years, people have complaints about him and about his certain decisions. He convinced many officers that Uthman radiallahu anhu was the real cause of all the trouble. So there was a secret society that developed in Egypt. They looked religious, they loved Islam apparently, they came up with their own idea. They were pious and sincere, but they were fake. And their main aim was political power. So they come from Egypt into Medina. And they focused on complaints. Complain, complain, complain. They campaigned against all the officers as insufficient, and they said they're not even God-fearing. And they started to forge letters, and they were sent out to city after city saying that there is injustice and unrest in the capital city of Medina. And they said that Ali, Talha, Zubair and others, the families of the Prophet ﷺ, were in support of this movement, but they lied. They were not in support of this movement. So people started thinking that there's widespread unrest under the Khalifa, and therefore the Khalifa must be removed. He's not a good leader. 12 years later they say this, in the last year of his Khilafah when he's an old man. They said anybody who doesn't agree with us, it means that you want an oppressive leader. And anyone who wants an oppressive leader is a hypocrite, he ought to be fought. Because the rule of Allah is more important and justice is more important. But they fabricated everything. So Uthman wanted to deal with these people. So he sends them off to Muawiya, who was in Syria, Muawiya. And he thinks that it will set them straight. So Muawiya is very kind to them. He says, listen guys, you're doing the wrong thing. This is not right. They didn't listen to him. So he sends them off to who? To the son of Khalid ibn al-Walid. The son of Khalid ibn al-Walid was very strong. And he set them straight. And so they went straight and they repented. But not for long. They go back to Iraq, and what happens? They come back with more news. People are stirring up stuff. Uthman gets accused by many things. They go to him, he uses public pastures for his own use. He uses public land for his own use. He prevents people from using them. He makes 4 copies of the Quran and sends each to a province. This is bid'ah. And he appoints young men as officers. He favors his relatives and gives them wealth. He gives his friends land. So Uthman sends for governors to meet with him in Medina, and they come together, and he said, what should I do with these guys? And they go, we declare jihad against them. He said, no, by Allah, I will not lift a sword, and not one of you will ever lift a sword. I will not be the first Khalifa in which I will be known that in my time I shed blood of Muslims. I'm an old man, and the Prophet ﷺ told me I'll be a shaheed anyway. I've got nothing to worry about. So they go back, and Muawiya says to him, listen Uthman, if you're in trouble, come to Syria, leave Medina, we'll protect you over here. You haven't got many men there. He only had like 500 people, men, women and children. He goes, you're not protected there. He said, Wallahi, I will not leave the neighbor of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, and I will not abandon Medina. No, I'm staying here. So the rebels, they used this opportunity to stir up trouble while governors were away. And they come to Medina with 700 men, who later on become the Khawarij. They were well organized, they had great army, they were well prepared. So they come to Medina and they face Uthman. And Uthman radiallahu anhu, he sends someone out, he says, find out what they want. And he comes back and he says, they're going to try and argue with you, and then they're going to take away some words back to Iraq and to Egypt and Syria, and they're going to tell them that you did not fulfill their requests, and then they're going to gather armies to come and overthrow you and kill you. So they go to him and they debate him. And he answers to them. He goes, the public pasture that you talk about that I use, I got 2 camels, and I go and I lead Hajj, as you know. And you know I was a successful businessman before, so I've got land which is my own. As for making 4 copies of the Quran, he goes, you know it's only one book of Allah sent, and we have 1 copy. I sent authorized copies to the governors which were compiled by the same companions who wrote it in front of the Prophet ﷺ. How can you accuse me of wanting to edit it? He goes, as for appointing young men, I appointed qualified men. The Prophet ﷺ appointed Usama ibn Zayd. Remember, he was a 17-year-old commander. I haven't done anything wrong. As for favoring and loving my relatives, he goes, there's nothing wrong with loving my relatives and giving them gifts. The gifts were from my private wealth, and I was doing it before I became a Khalifa. I just continued looking after my relatives. Any public money is used for public people. I didn't give my friends lands. They earned those lands, and they fought, they were soldiers, and they earned it and sold it to people in Medina. I didn't give anything to anybody. So the rebels, they all went quiet, but they were still not satisfied because they have a motive. They go back to Iraq and they go, hey, let's go tell him that he didn't listen to us. So they went to Ali, Zubayr, Talha, and told them, why don't you go and become leaders? Why don't you overthrow Uthman? You know, you're more worthy for it. And Ali, Talha, and Zubayr all said, never. We will pledge allegiance to Uthman and we'll follow him. And Uthman goes into the mosque and he stands up and he says, oh people, there are complaints against me and I have answers to them. But if I have made a mistake, he started crying. He said, please tell me, and I am ready to fix them by the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And I will now listen to Ali as my advisor. So Ali radiallahu anhu chases up to those rebels that left. Some went to Iraq, some went to Egypt, some went to Basra, so different directions. And he says to the people of Egypt, because the people of Egypt wanted Ali, he says to them, listen, everything's solved. This is what Uthman said. He's going to take my advice. And then they were satisfied. He returns, and then suddenly someone puts a fake letter. And the letter said, these rebels, O governors, when they reach you, kill them. No one knows where this letter came from. And he had the seal of Uthman radiallahu anhu on it. Historians say that he had lost his seal, but someone had forged it. When they returned, suddenly they were at the door of Uthman radiallahu anhu. And they were all chanting, revenge, revenge, revenge. He said, we got a letter that you wanted us dead as soon as we arrive. Ali radiallahu anhu susses this out. It's suspicious. So he comes up to him and he says, hold on. If the Egyptians came with this letter, what are you Kufan people and you Basra people doing here? You're supposed to be going that way. How did you get the news so quick? It takes about a couple of days to get to you. They go, we've come to support our allies. He said, how would you know so quick? He goes, someone among you is a hypocrite and he's stirring up trouble. So you know what they said to him? This is typical of people who've got an evil goal. They said, think what you want to think. This is what we want. So they go to him, so why did you and Aisha send us a letter to come back and overthrow the Khalifa anyway? Ali radiallahu anhu says, I've never sent that letter to you. Aisha radiallahu anhu, she says, my hand has never touched ink in that way. And then they go to him, all right, famous statement, wallahi, this is authentic. They said to him, you're either with us or against us. So Ali radiallahu anhu realized how they were trying to drag him into the Khilafah. So he goes and sits away. He says, you're not going to use me as your pawn. So he goes away, and the rioters go in front of Uthman radiallahu anhu in the house. And Uthman says, Wallahi, I did not order your death. Wallahi, I did not order your death. But if you did not write the letter and it was come and forged to us, and you didn't know about it, then you're also a bad leader. You don't deserve to be a Khalifa. So someone comes in and he says, Ya Uthman, they want to kill you. Or you can't be a Khalifa anymore. Uthman remembers what the Prophet ﷺ said to him. He said, Oh Uthman, Allah will give you the robe of leadership. Do not take it off when the hypocrites demand you to do so, until you meet me, until you die. And he said it 3 times. So he said, I will not take off the robe of honor which Allah had made me wear. What happens next is the worst thing that ever happened in history to the companions of the Prophet ﷺ. 40 days they were protesting, and then 20 days they made a siege around Uthman's house, radiallahu anhu. 700 people surrounded his house with no one to protect him. And they would not let him go out to pray Imam anymore. He was denied going to the masjid. So they go and elect someone among them to pray Imam. And the other companions wouldn't pray behind them. So then Uthman orders them to pray behind them. He said, politics is in Islam, but do not mix it with worship. Pray behind anyone who prays Imam. Just go for it. Don't worry about me. And so Uthman stayed in his house, praying, reading the Quran, fasting, and he could not get out. Then they heightened the siege, and they started preventing water from even entering the house of Uthman. They couldn't drink, so they started to go thirsty, him and his family. When Ali radiallahu anhu heard about this, he comes back and was very upset. So he gets some barrels of water to bring them in, and nobody would stop Ali radiallahu anhu. So they started drinking again. Then Ali went away. Then Habiba, the Prophet ﷺ's wife, al-Mu'mineen, the mother of the believers, she feels sorry for Uthman. So she comes on a camel and carrying some water to go to Uthman. She thinks, I'm the mother of the believers, they're not going to harm me. So they looked at her and they started abusing her. And one of them slapped her camel, which fell, and she almost fell and he almost trampled over her. So she goes back to Aisha radiallahu anha, and they stay away. These guys are crazy. No respect even to Prophet ﷺ's wives, the mother of the believers. And so Uthman stands up on the roof, and he says to everyone, "O companions," the companions come, and the rebels are standing there. So he says to the companions, "Do you bear witness that the Prophet ﷺ said, I am a shaheed?" And they all said with one word, "Yes, we bear witness." Then he said, "Do you bear witness that the Prophet ﷺ told me not to give up this khilafah?" And they all said yes. Then he goes, "Allahu Akbar, O protesters, do you hear? I've never apostated, I never murdered anyone, I never committed adultery. Why do you want to?" Then their ringleader goes, "Manipulator!" And the rioters kept on going. Uthman radiallahu anhu goes back inside his house. And it was almost time for Hajj season. And the rebels are thinking, if we let them go to Hajj, they'll group each other and they'll get helpers, and by the time they return, they'll probably stop us from our rioting. So they wanted to take action quickly before anybody comes back. Uthman is still by himself, he's only got a couple of companions to protect him, nobody's really there. And then a man, a Sahabi named Mughira, he comes in and he says, "Oh Amir al-Mu'mineen, what will we say to Allah if we don't protect you? I've got to protect you." He says, "Don't lift the sword." But he wouldn't listen. He goes outside to fight them off, and they him. Then suddenly, Muhammad ibn Abu Bakr, Abu Bakr anhu's son, Muhammad, there were only two tabi'een, they weren't companions, who followed this rebel group, Muhammad ibn Abu Bakr and Muhammad ibn Ja'far, brainwashed by them. So he was also against Uthman. And now the water is denied again. They're not drinking. They got no food. They've got no supplies. They can't go to the masjid. Uthman radiallahu anhu is stuck in there. It kept on going until the last day. Uthman goes to sleep, fasting. And he sees the Prophet ﷺ in his dreams. And Abu Bakr is with him and Umar. And the Prophet ﷺ says to Uthman, Ya Uthman, they made you thirsty. Oh Uthman, they sieged you, they won't let you out. Ya Uthman, do you want to break your fast with us tonight? And then Uthman wakes up. He gathers his family, his children, his slaves, whoever they were, and he frees all his 20 slaves. He changes his clothing and wears something tighter and longer. In case they killed him and his awra would show, he was very shy, remember? He wants to cover himself. And he says to his wife, Atika, he says, I don't want to eat. For the Prophet ﷺ said to me, you will meet me fasting. So I want to stay fasting and break my fast with the Prophet ﷺ. The next day Fajr came. And Uthman, 83-year-old man, weak, and all he wants is peace between the Muslims. He puts his own life on the line. But I will not give up my khilafah. So he says to his wife, I'm fasting and I would like you to leave my house. It was a big palace. Go to the other rooms. I don't want you to be harmed. So they listened to him. Then he wrote a letter, Uthman. He says, Uthman bears witness that there is no God but Allah and Muhammad is his messenger. Jannah is true. Hellfire is true. And Allah will raise me up. This is true. On it Uthman lives. On it Uthman dies. And on it Uthman will be raised. Suddenly Muhammad, the son of Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, he is the first one to come in. He sees Uthman radiallahu anhu while Uthman is reading the Quran. And he grabs his beard and he shakes it. Muhammad, son of Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu. Uthman looks up at him and for the first time he shows firmness in toughness or in harshness. He says to him, woe to you, Muhammad. Wallahi, if your father was alive, he would never do what you are doing. Between me and you is the book of Allah. And for some reason, Muhammad shook and he went pale and he got very scared. So he ran away and never took part in with the rebels ever again until he died. Then suddenly, two men. One of them was called Al-Maut Al-Aswad, Black Death. And with him was another man called Saudan ibn Hamdan and a few others. They enter. And the first thing Black Death does, he grabs a rope while Uthman radiallahu anhu is reading the Quran. And he puts it around his neck and starts choking him. Subhanallah, this hypocrite man, he says, I found him when I was him. He was moving around like someone who was possessed with a jinn. Oh, how easy him was. And then suddenly, his wife comes to protect him, Atika. She comes in. She places her hand out as they drew out the sword. And they off her 4 fingers. And she goes away screaming. Then, Maut al-Aswad, he comes up to Uthman. And he tries to strike Uthman's head with the sword. And Uthman puts his hand up to protect himself. And he cuts off his right hand. And the blood falls on the Quran. And Uthman looks at his hand. And he says, by Allah, this hand is the first one that wrote from the Quran. And then his blood falls on the Quran. And the blood comes on one ayah. The ayah says, فَسَيَكْفِيكَهُمُ اللَّهُ. Allah will save you from them. Brothers and sisters, this mushaf, it's called Mushaf Uthman. If you don't believe me, it's still in the museum in Istanbul. And I saw it with my eyes. It is the same copy that was in his hand with the blood right on that verse. And then came the other guy and he says, Uthman, 6 with his dagger. And this is what he says. This is 3 for the sake of Allah, and 6 because of a grudge I had against you. And so Uthman radiallahu anhu dies. The companions find out and they go berserk. Ali radiallahu anhu hears about it and he starts to cry and he says, woe to them and what they have done. I ask Allah to unite me with Uthman in Jannah. Uthman, the beloved of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And Ali radiallahu anhu starts crying for him. He says, if you want to pledge allegiance to me, wallahi, I'm too embarrassed to put my hand out. Later on, a few days passed and some of them they regretted. And you know what Ali radiallahu anhu said to them? He said, you are like that verse in the Quran. You are like the shaitan who says to the person, become a kafir. When a person becomes a kafir, the shaitan says, I am innocent. You are nothing but shayateen.